Welcome to the XJO podcast. I'm Juliana Pandurevic. Here we explore journalism innovation, including the way academics are sharing their research in new ways that target a wider audience. This podcast showcases some of the researchers on the XJO team. Today's guest is Sara Esayas, a recent graduate of the Communication and Culture Joint Master's Program at Toronto Metropolitan University and York University. For the Explanatory Journalism and Uptake project, Sara has worked alongside Dr. Frauke Zeller, researching the news coverage and framing of BIPOC communities in North American print news media. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Sara about her research and passion for researching race and its relationship to the media. Well, thanks for being with us here today, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a bit about the work that you've completed with Dr. Zeller.
So the work that I've completed alongside Dr. Zeller has really been a team effort. So our team, which included Dr. Zeller, Justine Woods, Kimberly Fortin, and Lauren Dwyer, were able to analyze news media's portrayal of minority groups across Turtle Island during 2020. So we did this through the application of news framing and critical race theory frameworks. And in this work, we really made an effort to acknowledge how terms like BIPOC can be really helpful in promoting allyship and discussing large trends that marginalized groups often face. However, we also really try to address the specific groups, so Black communities, diverse Indigenous communities, and other racialized groups separately as well, with an eye for ensuring that the specific historical context necessary to understand the treatments of these groups really informs our work. We also use statistical corpus linguistics, which is actually a method Dr. Zeller introduced us to, alongside inductive qualitative analysis, so that we can explore media frames and language use that are the North American newspapers that we selected used when reporting on these groups.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit about what you learned with this research?
So the research was very rewarding and it was very interesting to complete. So working with corpus tools to look at language specifically, like what words were used in relation to other words and what the use of those words means more broadly, and kind of seeing and finding larger connections was super informative. So our main findings showed an uptick in reporting on Black communities, both in Canada and in the United States in 2020. And we also found that Indigenous peoples are commonly framed as possessive of Canada in print news media through language that situates Indigenous peoples in close proximity to the nation state. And in doing so, kind of solidifies the continual framing of Indigenous people alongside negative stereotypes. And we also found a severe lack of reporting of the anti-Asian hate that was prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Could you talk to us about why the exploration of coverage surrounding the BIPOC community in North American print news? Why is it so important to talk about and to research as you guys did?
Yeah, no, of course, it's an important question, especially right now. And the exploration of the coverage surrounding various BIPOC communities in North American print news media was incredibly important because news media plays such a critical role in framing our understanding of marginalized communities, particularly those that are Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And by understanding the language that is kind of systematically employed to discuss racialized groups, we can see how these groups are covered and framed in news media, and this helps us to understand and possibly challenge these representations.
And why did you choose to focus on print news versus television, for example? And if you could just clarify for our audience, when you say print, does that mean newspaper and text as an online content? And if you could also tell us about which print news outlets you guys studied.
Our choice to focus on print news was really a practical one. The analysis that the method that we used when we conducted our analysis was like a text-based statistical analysis. And that just lent itself well to print news media content, including the content that we retrieved online. And yeah, currently, as far as the field of journalism studies goes, much of the literature and the theories that support and explain results focus a lot on print news media. And in addition, because our project, we're also focusing on the conversation, which, although is disseminated kind of online, is still in a text-based format. We wanted to remain consistent in our comparisons and in our applications. When we selected newsprint media outlets, we really focused on ensuring we had regional balance and focused on circulation to make sure that our sample was representative. So the papers that we ended up focusing on in Canada were the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Toronto Star, in addition to the Conversation Canada as the explanatory journalism source. And the American outlets that we selected were the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and then we used the Conversation US as well for our explanatory journalism source.
Did you notice a difference between American newsprint media versus Canadian?
There were like slight differences in terms of like different language use. We found a very interesting finding in that Canadian newspapers have a tendency, particularly in relation to Black communities, to cover Black Americans more than Black Canadians. And we think that that's part of, Canada's focus on multiculturalism and saying, that stuff happens in the US, it doesn't really happen here. And that was kind of a really, really interesting finding that we saw.
That is really interesting. And you were mentioning earlier a severe lack of coverage surrounding the hate that was being spewed towards Asian communities as a result of COVID. Did you find it was an even distribution of, let's say, lack of coverage throughout Canadian and American media, or was there one side that was a little bit more generous in their coverage, or were they equally lacking?
We found that they were equally lacking. But we did find that the conversation did have more coverage as well as more in-depth coverage. Like a lot of the words that we found around that specifically, would use words like outcome and disparities, and there was a lot more depth to that coverage, but it was equally lacking in both countries.
Right. Okay, thank you. And since, this whole project that we're all working on falls under the umbrella of explanatory journalism, could you talk to us a bit about what role can explanatory journalism play in the framing of these communities?
Explanatory journalism can play a crucial role in the framing of marginalized communities. In our study, we see this as we find that kind of what I was talking about a bit earlier, explanatory journalism sources, in this case, the Conversations Canada and US, were able to provide more context to their discussions of marginalized communities. So for instance, through a decrease in the use of quotations and a focus on contextualizing the topic of the article, readers are able to get an article that tells more of the full story or shows the big picture instead of like a snapshot into an issue or an event with no further insights into the how and the why and, the implications.
What led you to study race and ethnicity and its relationship to the media?
As a Black woman, I've always been very interested in depictions of race and ethnicity in media, going as far back as high school, and have always gravitated particularly to depictions of race and ethnicity in film, TV, and journalism. So I did my undergrad at U of T in political science and media studies explicitly because of my sometimes very nerdy interest in the field, and was always looking for opportunities in the classroom and outside of it to bring those two fields together. And that's why it's been really great, working on the XJO project, because a lot of the time as an undergraduate student or an early graduate student, you work on research projects and you do a lot of like data entry or manual coding of results, which is good experience. However, on this project, Dr. Zeller really has focused on empowering graduate students to conduct research and supporting them through that process. And so having an opportunity to, author a paper on a topic that has always been important and interesting to me has been really, really great.
So what are you working on now? Do you have any future projects that you're working towards, or what's going on in your life?
So I finished up my master's in communication and culture in the spring, which was great as, my interest that we just talked about in race and ethnicity in relation to media and the research skills I built while like working on XJO really helped me with my own master's project, which explored Western print news media coverage of conflict in African countries, particularly Ethiopia in my case, which is where my family is from. And I've done a lot of work with TMU's Black Studies minor program, which just launched this year, and may move back into doing some work with that as well. But I'm mainly going through an application cycle at the moment because I cannot get enough of school, and I'm hoping some good news on that front.
We're all looking forward to see what comes next for you because you've done so much good work for the XJO project already. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit and talk to us about what you've done, and hopefully we can have you back later on and see what you've been up to.
It's been lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me and for facilitating such a great conversation today. It's been really great.
And that was Sara Esayas on her work with XJO, focusing on the news coverage and framing of BIPOC communities in North American print news media. To learn more about Sara's work and the XJO project, visit our website at torontomu.ca/explanatory-journalism.